who are you, and why do you sound like you're in pain? And is there anything that I can do for you? And the voice says, no, there's nothing you can do for me. However, there will be born to a certain couple in Rome a young man who will later become a great saint. And when he says Mass 16 times, I will be liberated from this kind of purgatorial anguish that I am suffering through. It's a little bit like the ghost of Hamlet's father coming to him, imposing this mission on him. So the Pope, apparently moved by compassion for this suffering soul, goes out and he finds these two parents that the soul had spoken about. And the parents, of course, are probably glad to give over to the Pope their son, who will be taken good care of, given a good education and so forth. So he raises him, and just about the time that the son is turning 7, he sends him into school. But he doesn't do very well. He's the slow wit of the class. And so when he's in church, he prays to the Virgin Mary to bestow upon him knowledge. And she says, well, kiss my statue, and you will know everything that there is to know. So he goes to the statue and kisses it, and he later becomes known as John Goldenmouth, because he has this halo of gold around his mouth, because when he speaks, he appears to know everything. And so he begins lecturing on Aristotle and Plato and so forth to all the pupils of the class, and they're like, how did you get this smart overnight? I mean, just the other night the master was whipping you and couldn't get a word out of you edgewise. So he grows up, and about the time that he turns 16, he says his first Mass. And as the Pope is very excited about it, and as he's going through the process of doing the Mass, something doesn't feel right. He feels like he's too young to do this. He doesn't feel like he knows, really, he understands the theory of what he's doing, but some kind of experience is missing. So he decides to go off into the forest and become a monk, an ascetic, and disavows all worldly possessions. So he disappears out into the forest, and he builds a little hut for himself next to a cliff at the edge of a forest. And he lives there for some time, performing his monkish ascetic duties and so forth. Meanwhile, in the forest nearby, there lives an emperor, and his daughter and her sisters are out one day picking flowers. And a tornado comes along, or a gale of some sort, picks them all up, and shuffles them around and puts them down again, but when the girls come down, the princess is missing. Meanwhile, the tornado has carried her right to the doorstep of John Chrysosto. And here she is, probably this beautiful young thing, 14, 15 years old, and she shows up at this celibate's hut, and he says, well, I'll take you in, but we're going to spend all of our time praying, and that's all we're going to do, and I'm going to draw this line down the center of the hut, and neither one of us are allowed to cross over it. We'll have to keep it that way. Well, of course, things don't last very long. That arrangement doesn't work, and the devil comes to him one night and tempts him, and he goes over and has sex with this woman. And the next morning, they both feel remorse at their sin. And he thinks, well, if I keep her around, I'll keep doing this again and again and again, and I'll just never get through this process. So he leads her out to the edge of the cliff and shoves her off. And then he thinks, well, now that's actually an even worse sin, isn't it, than fornication. So he thinks he's in anguish about this, and he doesn't know what to do, and he thinks, well, I'll go to the Pope and make a confession. So he goes to the Pope. The Pope it's still the same Pope, but he doesn't recognize him, and he tells him the story of having murdered this young girl and how remorseful he feels about it, but the Pope basically tells him to get lost and says, this is just a beastly thing that you have done. You should forget about your life from this point on. So he wanders off back to his little hut, and he thinks, if I've done a beastly thing, perhaps I am a beast, and I will now take a vow that I will behave as such. So he drops off all of his clothing, and he goes around on all fours. And his beard grows, and he grows all of this hair, and years pass by, and he sleeps and walks and lives like an animal. Meanwhile, the emperor who has lost his daughter, the wife has now had a new infant, and the Pope has come to this castle to baptize it. But as he is just about to baptize the infant speaks and says, you cannot baptize me. The only person who will be able to baptize me properly will be St. John, whom God will send to me from the wilderness. The Pope says, does anybody know who this St. John is? And nobody knows, of course. But meanwhile, the emperor's huntsmen have caught this strange, interesting little animal, and they bring it in, and it scurries under the table. And the infant points to it and says, John, your time has come to baptize me. And John looks out from under the table, and he says, if I have heard aright, the voice of God is speaking through you. And he says, say that again. And the infant says, yes, you must come now and baptize me. and accept your destiny. So he stands up, and all this stuff falls off of him, this leathery skin. He probably hasn't exfoliated in a long time. And stands up and baptizes the infant. And then he explains to the Pope his life story, who he was. The Pope is overjoyed to have found him again. And he explains to the emperor what happened to the daughter. And the emperor says, that's awful. Would you take me out to the cliff so that we can find and collect her remains? So John leads them out into the wilderness to the edge of the cliff. And they look over the cliff, and there's this young girl sitting down, cross-legged, all the way down below. And he says, who are you? And she looks up and says, don't you recognize me? And he says, no. And she says, well, I'm the same person that you thought you had murdered. God actually bore me up, and I have been waiting for your return ever since. And he says, he was, of course, overjoyed at this. The emperor is overjoyed at having recovered his daughter. And then the Pope says, let me explain to you what started this whole thing. It was this soul that was in this purgatorial anguish who will not be released until you say Mass 16 times. Would you please go and do that? So he says 1 Mass a day for the next 16 days. The soul is liberated, and he is eventually made into a bishop, and he becomes famous as a writer and church father. So that is the story of the legend of the life of St. John Chrysostom. And as you can see, there's really a kind of, there's a rejection in the story of the Catholic idea that the sacraments are inviolable. If they are ordained by a priest, the theory is, according to Augustine, that the sacraments have a magical efficacy that is such that when they are administered, it doesn't make any difference what the moral character of the priest administering the sacraments is. They simply work. Augustine had been condemning the Donatist heresy, and Donatists had taken the opposite point of view and said, no, the sacraments do not work unless they come of a virtuous person. So we get this interesting disjunction here between simply performing the rites of an office that you have inherited and may not even belong in, versus the authenticity of living a life that has brought you to that point where you are properly belonging. And so the whole story of St. John Chrysostom could be read as this idea of, if he's going to be a priest and be a good and proper priest, he should know about things like compassion and sin. So it should be the case that he should go out and sin and learn about sin and what it all is about. And so we have this kind of, in the story, there's a kind of Northern European attitude of respect for the individual life and the individual adventure versus the imposed Levantine, Judeo-Christian, Islamic external authority that says it doesn't make any difference what the quality of your life is so long as you follow the rules and obey the sacraments and so forth. So we've got these two different traditions here, and one could say that the reason the Protestant outbreak took place was precisely because it was Northern Europe finding itself in terms of this idea of respect for the individual life and rejecting the priesthood. So we have these various elements going on with respect to the individual adventure. And once again, we have the idea that if the person is going to inherit the office, he has first, in the case of John Chrysostom as a priest, he has first to learn about sin. If Khanate is going to rule effectively, he has first to learn about chaos and trusting the non-rational forces of nature. So we have these two fables of transformation and maturity and adolescence. Both of these characters begin as adolescents when they go into their transformative adventure, and their transformations have the effect through integrating the repressed aspects of their personality, that which they are not consciously in their conscious life. They attain a wholeness that enables them to effectively hold their offices, and not just as, you got the job because you knew so-and-so. Well, do you really like the job? No, but it pays a lot of money. Well, what are you doing there? Does it have anything to do with you? And so forth. I was actually, just as a personal aside, I was actually hired when I was working in the Joseph Campbell Foundation. The editor who was there and editing Joseph Campbell's books and who I was working under actually hated Joseph Campbell, did not like the works at all, and I could never figure out what he was doing there. And it became evident in the scholarship, in the volumes that he produced, that they were quite inferior and a very poor judgment, because he just didn't know what he was doing. He had inherited that position because he was being paid, and it was opportunistic, and it was a good thing, and all of that, but the soul was missing, the inwardness, the belongingness. And I think we find this in our society an awful lot, this idea of living wrongly in the sense of doing something that you really shouldn't be doing because it doesn't have anything to do with you. It has